everyone, Lisa here. I'm just doing a quick check-in video because a few things have kind of happened. There have been a few developments since I last did my full moon in Cancer video for Bitcoin, and I just thought I'd kind of address them because there seems to be a lot of fear around, like in the market, particularly given the upcoming Fed meeting that's happening on the 25th of January, and how that seems to be kind of sending jitters through the market. So I just thought I'd go through a few things, and I thought we'd look at the Federal Reserve chart because it's quite interesting actually, and also just recap a couple of things that I said during the November and the December eclipse forecast, just so that we can get more of a sense of where we are and kind of orient ourselves so that we don't, panic too much, essentially. Yes, I mean, it is fair to say that we are kind of seemingly at a turning point, but I don't think it's as kind of disastrous as people are kind of feeling that it is. I think that there's more of a kind of an exaggerated sense of fear at the moment. So I'll kind of get into why I think that, and then we can go from there. So if we just have a look at the current transits from the point of view of human design, because I think, talk through the astrological transits in my last video, the full moon in Cancer, in quite a lot of detail. So I'm not going to go through those now, but what I'm going to look at is a snapshot of where the planets, particularly the Sun and Mercury, are currently sitting in the human design chart, because I think that gives us a snapshot of perhaps why we are, as a kind of a collective, feeling this this kind of retreat into fear. So this is for the period of the 23rd to the 27th or so of January, and we can see both the Sun and Mercury are making a conjunction today in hexagram 41 line 2. You can see both of these transits are in exactly the same hexagram, and this hexagram sits in the root of the human design body graph, and so we can see that it's switching on the channel between what's known as this is kind of the emotional center, which goes very much, it cycles very much along lunar lines, and then we've got the root center, which is all about survival, resources, abundance, etc., etc. So essentially we've got this connection happening between the 41 and the 30, and the 30 in the Bitcoin charts is where the Venus kind of sits, the design Venus. So it's interesting because Venus, of course, is retrograde at the moment, and I think together with Mercury, which retrograded on the 14th or so, it's causing a lot of confusion and a kind of a dampening down of positive sentiment that I don't think is kind of helping. So in other words, I heard Kevin Paffrath say this, and I thought it's a good way to actually sum up the sort of Venus-Mercury retrograde sentiment, which is even good news is bad news. That it's not really enough to kind of get people psychologically feeling optimistic at the moment. There's quite a depressed sort of atmosphere, and that's normal for January. We've just come out of goat season, which is very serious, and of course a lot of people struggle financially during January with things like tax returns and the hangover from Christmas. So that's not really surprising. But then on top of that, we've also got, as I said, the Sun and Mercury in gate 41 line 2 in the root, and this is all about in the I Ching, it's about sacrifice or decrease. So it's the opposite of increase, which is hexagram 42, and that's all about the sun kind of coming into its full power. So this is almost the opposite, and of course we're still in winter. Certainly in the northern hemisphere, the sun, although it is rising in declination from that solstice point, we still haven't, it still hasn't kind of risen sufficiently for us to get to the equinoxes where there's kind of equal day night. So we're still very much in winter, and February traditionally, sort of January, February during Aquarius season is the coldest month of the year, and that's because the earth is tilted away from the sun. We've got this slightly tilted axis, so that the what do they call it, the obliquity of the axis, that's at kind of 23 degrees. So that means that at the moment the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun, so that's why it's traditionally quite a cold time of the year. So we have to kind of bear this in mind, and we have just had the wolf moon too, which is quite a lean kind of moon, given the in terms of kind of Native American law and that kind of thing. But just focusing for a minute on gate 41.2, as I said, is about sacrifice and decrease, and this is all about the ability to work with limited resources or in limiting circumstances, and that's what we're kind of seeing at the moment. Bitcoin, when I began my last forecast, we talked about how Bitcoin was at this pivot point where it could go up or it could go down. It was kind of at the bottom of a head and shoulders, but it could actually go further down in terms of the macro chart, if we kind of zoomed out. Or it could go up again, and a lot of us were waiting for it to go back up to around 51, 52, which would have been support level. So at the moment things are looking quite bearish, and I think this is reflected in what the human design is telling us. So it's saying it's smart at the moment to dispose of what's superfluous or unnecessary. So if you do have assets that are kind of cutting your losses, if you do feel that you don't want to, you don't have the patience to sort of wait a couple of months for certain assets to recover, particularly on the stock markets and that kind of thing, then the I Ching is saying, all right, well, maybe it's time to sort of get a little bit more lean and mean and to sort of cut your losses in certain areas. And then overall it's saying that the wisdom comes by cycling through the entire emotional wave before acting. So as I said, this emotional center, which is connected to the root via this 4130, is very much about the cycling of the emotions with the moon. So as I said in my last forecast, I did expect that things could kind of get a little bit meh during this waning moon period, because as I say, Venus is retrograde, Mercury is retrograde, and there's not really much happening in terms of good aspects to the chart. We'll look at that in a moment, but there's not enough to sort of really get people feeling euphoric again, which is what's needed, for the bull market to kind of continue. And we are coming out of that, still the shadow of that Saturn-Uranus square. So it is interesting, and I think what they're saying here in human design terms is, we might be feeling a lot of fear now, but we need to cycle through the whole cycle. So for me, a waning moon cycle is 2 weeks, so it will take us to the end of January, and that of course is when Venus is going to move direct, and in fact a few things are going to happen more or less at the same time. So I think what it's kind of saying is, just as much as we shouldn't necessarily give into euphoria and take ridiculous risks, but at the same time we shouldn't necessarily capitulate to fear, particularly if it is fear that is slightly irrational. And we're going to look at why I say this in when we get to sort of further on in the video. But essentially what the I Ching is suggesting that we do now is to balance giving and receiving, outgoings and incomings. So kind of taking stock, doing our accounts, and of course a lot of us are doing tax returns this time of the year. So it is just a time to kind of take stock and see how much risk we can afford at the moment. And also, we also do have to bear in mind that the Gann cycles, are kind of potentially pointing to recession either from kind of autumn of 2022 or sometime in 2023. So there is a need to be cautious and to prepare for all eventualities. And as I said last time, when I talked about Mercury retrograde, that it's also important to protect your assets against theft or against fraud, or just people who want to sort of snap up your Bitcoin at cut prices, or whatever your investment is. So we'll kind of get into that next. But I just thought this helps to explain where we are right now in terms of mentality. So here's the Bitcoin chart for today, which is the 20. I've set it for the 25th of January because that's when the Fed is going to have its next meeting, and a lot of what we are seeing now could be panic, because some people think that the Fed could announce a surprise interest rate hike around about the 25th when they come to meet again. And the Fed does seem to have turned a little bit hawkish in the last couple of months, basically since November, which is when they announced that they were going to be tapering, and they were going to do so quite aggressively. And so back in November when I did my lunar eclipse forecast, I did say that I expected a taper tantrum in December when we had that Saturn-Uranus square, and that's what happened. So I think it's interesting that in this chart we've got a grand cross with Saturn and Uranus on the angle, so you can see this great big square that we've got sort of going on here. And you can see Uranus, which is recently stationed on the 18th or so of January, so very close to the full moon in Cancer. Now what's interesting is that Uranus stationed around about the 18th of January, and it did so at 10 degrees of Taurus, which is the same point that it was at when that it reached exactitude with that square to Saturn. You can see Saturn's kind of moved on to 14 or so. And so what's going to happen is that as Uranus changes direction and moves into further, like back over the degrees of Taurus, it's going to revisit some of the degrees that had passed over previously in December, like November, December. So that can sometimes reactivate the energy that we felt back then, which was a lot of fear. So I'm not really surprised to be seeing this kind of panic and anxiety around. Uranus can affect our nerves. It can make us very anxious and jumpy, and it can also affect technology. So again, I'm not surprised to see the Nasdaq kind of bleeding out. But once it moves past about 14 degrees or so of Aquarius, I think that or sort of 14 degrees of Taurus, I think it's heading back towards the Bitcoin part of fortune, which it will get to in around about June or so. And that kind of coincides with what Ken Stanfield was saying about how the Bitcoin cycle is lengthening, the bull cycle, that we are probably only going to see a euphoric top around about May, June. So I really don't think that this bull cycle is finished. And I think that we need to just kind of gird our loins and sort of hang in there and just see this as being fallout from that Saturn-Uranus square that we had in November, December. So that's something to bear in mind. And kind of going back to this big T square that we've got here, we do also have these two fixed stars down the bottom here, Acrux and Alphecca, which are very prominent, as I say, first of all in the Federal Reserve chart, secondly in Biden's chart, and thirdly, they do tend to be highlighted at around about the time of American presidential elections because they happen in November, and that's when the sun is in this portion of the sky. So, around about, kind of the sort of early degrees of Scorpio. So it does tend to it points to the importance of American political or kind of domestic policy. And so I think that the role of the Treasury here could be important, as well, in terms of, what kind of happens on the 25th when the Federal Reserve has its next meeting, that, kind of domestic policy also needs to be kind of, could also play a role. It's not just about kind of macroeconomic policy. And of course the moon rules the people, the populace, and we are talking about the fourth house of Bitcoin. So it could be that on some level we kind of that fundamentals and American domestic policy may play a role in whatever kind of happens in the short term. So that's one thing to consider. But on the more positive side, as Uranus moves back through Aquarius, through Taurus, it's going to be tightening up a really lovely trine to Venus, which I mentioned in my last forecast. So by the time Venus comes to station at the end of the month, on the 29th, just before the new moon in Aquarius, which happens on the 1st of February, it's moving into orb of a really lovely trine to Venus. And of course Venus is the wealth maker, it's one of the benefics, so that is very positive for Bitcoin. And I do think that it could coincide with a trend change, particularly when it comes to investor sentiment, because of its rulership over the descendant of the Bitcoin chart, which is all about stakeholders and investors, that kind of thing. So I really don't think that the bull market is finished. There are some other things that we'll kind of get into, particularly around Jupiter, which I think are also important, that we do have to kind of weigh up in relation to previous economic cycles, the Gann cycles and that kind of thing. So it's not all kind of cut and dried, but I do think that in the short term, I'm not surprised to be seeing this kind of fear around, but I think it will be short-lived. As far as Jupiter was concerned, I've said from the beginning that Jupiter is very important when it comes to Bitcoin. We did have the Jupiter return of Bitcoin in 2020, which, culminated with those all-time highs and things that we had, particularly during the festive season. And then it also coincided with the crash in May of 2021. So Jupiter moved back into Pisces on the 13th, around about the 13th or 14th of May, and that's exactly when Bitcoin crashed. When we had that kind of mid-cycle slump. So, and a lot of people were pointing to kind of Wyckoff patterns, and of course Wyckoff patterns are linked to institutions. So why are we surprised that we are having kind of lows when we're expecting highs, and that kind of thing. It's all designed to kind of create cognitive dissonance, if you like, in retail investors, and so that they capitulate, and investors can hoover up your cheap Bitcoin. So that's just something to kind of bear in mind as we kind of move forward. So I think as I was kind of pointing out again in my other forecasts, as we move into into January, that I said at the time that Jupiter was going to enter Pisces, and that there is this history of crashes when Jupiter enters Pisces, and I took it back to 1927, 1928, 1974, 1975, 86 to 87, and 98 to 99. So these are all largely kind of mini crashes, although of course 27, 28 was very close to October 29th, 1929, which led to the sort of the huge depression of the 1930s. But yes, we'll I think what we need to kind of bear in mind as well is that essentially what we're doing is we are trying to kind of balance or weight like opposing influences. So it's not a kind of a cut and dried case of like, oh yes, definitely Bitcoin's going to go up and that's all that I see in the chart. It's a case of kind of weighing up the probabilities, and there are some kind of signs that we do need to kind of take into consideration, and that is the Gann cycles, which do point to possibly a crash around about 2023. So as I've kind of discussed in other videos, which I will which I'll link to this video, particularly as I say, the solar eclipse forecast that I did back in December, that the current Gann cycle runs from 2007 to about 2027, and according to the Gann cycle, when we get to 2022, we are kind of hitting the top of the speculative bubble in the market. You can see here it says bubble, and so this is a time essentially to sell, but I don't think that we've reached highs yet, because of where Jupiter and the fact that Jupiter and Venus still have room to run, and that Uranus is coming back online. So I think it's too early to say that we are definitely heading downwards and there's no kind of recovery. I think we do have to also bear in mind what Ken Stanfield said about the Bitcoin charts and the Bitcoin cycle, which is they are getting 30 to 40% longer. So I don't think we've hit our peak yet. He's predicting that we'll hit a peak in May, and so I think it's too early to say, it's too early to call basically a bear market at this point. But we do have to bear in mind, as I say, that in terms of the Gann cycle, that we're moving from this euphoria in 2022 to a crash possibly in 2023. You can see decline here, and you can see previous periods where we've had declines in the Gann cycle along this point. It's interesting that the bubble here coincides with periods like 1928, 1929, which were preceded by bubbles. So it's not a case of, there is no kind of correlation. Usually before a crash there is a huge bubble, but it usually bursts in the autumn. It usually bursts around about September or October. You get your euphoric high, and then you start to get a decline in the market. So I do think that the earliest that we could move into a recession would be the autumn of 2022. But as I say, we do have to bear in mind that cycles might be getting longer, and that there are people out there, large players who can manipulate the market if they so desire. So, we also have to take those factors into consideration, that it's not a clear-cut thing. I just want to mention this too. I do follow the work of the analyst Alessio Rostani, and he's quite big into Elliot wave theory. And a couple of weeks ago, he did a timeline for when he thought that there might be a major Wall Street crash based on the work of Robert Prechter, who is very much into using Elliot wave theory to predict like crowd psychology. And so this is a timeline based on Elliot waves, kind of macro Elliot waves. So Elliot waves tend to move in, you get like 5 up waves, and then you tend to get a 3-wave correction. So we can see here that we've in terms of the macro cycle, we've moved from 1, 2, 3, 4, kind of 5, which he kind of puts the sort of euphoric bull market kind of peaking in around about exactly the time that I'm talking about, so the autumn of 2022, into the summer possibly of 2023, that he thinks we're still in this wave 5, which is still kind of the last kind of euphoric move upwards, and that we will probably only have a crash leading to a prolonged bear market from the autumn of 2022 2023. So for me this kind of corroborates first of all the Gann cycle, and secondly what Ken Stanfield is saying about Bitcoin, and thirdly the astrology, which, as I say, it still has room to run. So yes, this is a kind of a pictorial version of the same thing where he's talking about this Elliot wave. So it went up to 1929, and then there was a correction, then it went up again until about 2000 when we had the dot-com crash, then we had a kind of mini correction into 2008 2009, which did last quite a long time. It was like 10 years or so, but then we kind of in this upward trajectory here as far as Robert Prechter is concerned, and as I say, it does only peak in the autumn of 2022. So I think there is still some room to run in this bull market. Okay, so let's move on to the Federal Reserve chart, and what I thought I'd do is I'd have a look at the chart itself, and then we can kind of get into the transits on the 25th of January, because it's useful sometimes to just kind of work out what the main significators are and what they mean, and then it helps us kind of to understand what might be activated when we get transits. So I think the first thing to say about the chart is that it's got cardinal angles. It has Aries rising, 0 degrees Aries rising, and that's because I've rectified it to 2 minutes past 12 on the 23rd of December 1913, which is when the Federal Reserve Charter kind of came into effect, was signed by Woodrow Wilson. And when we don't know the exact time of something, we tend to time it for sort of midday. But I think midday itself gives us late degrees of Pisces and Virgo rising, which didn't make sense to me. Whereas I think 2 minutes on, this makes a lot more sense. So it means essentially that in a way the Federal Reserve chart reflects what's known as the thema mundi, which is what Hellenistic astrologers would had kind of created as the sort of the birth chart of the world, if you like. And to have the cardinal signs on the angles is, I think, very appropriate, because it sort of reflects this idea of the solstices and the equinoxes, which is so important in Western astrology, which is very solar based. And of course each of these particular signs are associated with either the equinoxes, as in the Aries Libra kind of sort of axis, and then the solstices, which are currently governed by Cancer and Capricorn. So I think that's very, very fitting. And then the second thing is that we've got some really interesting planets on the MCIC axis. So we've got the Sun at midday, kind of on the midheaven, and it's just ingressed into the sign of Capricorn. I think this is very fitting because the Federal Reserve was essentially created to kind of keep the system stable and to help sort of regulate the financial system and stop the sort of constant crises and the bank runs that had kind of happened regularly, from at least the early 1800s kind of onwards. I mean, I was quite interested to see the dates of panics that we don't really know about now, such as 1819, 1837, 1893, and 1896, when there were all kind of panics in America and runs on the banks, and then the main one being in April of 1906, when we had there was an earthquake in San Francisco, and this led to a recession, and in turn, a run on the banks, and this is what precipitated the first of all JP Morgan, and then several other bankers, followed by Senator Nelson Aldrich, to kind of do what they could to enact this Federal Reserve Charter, which eventually was sort of agreed by Congress. So it's very, very interesting, and I think Sun and Capricorn is very fitting here. It's a very responsible sign. It tends to sort of err on the side of caution. It's very pragmatic. It doesn't shy away from responsibility, and it's that very paternal energy associated with the father. So it's interesting that it's in the 10th house, which is associated with kind of Capricorn, Saturn anyway, and and then it's right on the midheaven, so it's very, very prominent. So I think that's very fitting for an organization that is supposed to sort of regulate and stabilize. And then opposite, we've got Pluto in Cancer. Now that's super interesting. This is down here. You can see conjunct the IC, and I mean this is super interesting because a lot of people point to the fact that Pluto currently is in the opposite sign. It's currently in Capricorn. So there's this very interesting link to the period when Pluto was transiting through the sign of Cancer, and many people point to how at that stage there was a lot more focus on the kind of the nuclear family and on kind of trying to keep things together on that level. And you had these very strong kind of paternal figures that were the sort of the heads of the family, and that a lot of that has started to erode, particularly from the sort of 60s onwards, once birth control was introduced, and that this really saw divorce rates kind of soar, and the traditional nuclear family kind of fall apart, so that we are almost in this sort of in a completely different position to that period when Pluto was kind of transiting through Cancer now. And of course the Saturn Pluto conjunctions were key in certainly in the pandemic, and also in the sort of structural changes that have kind of emerged from that, which many people see as being an important element of the so-called Great Reset. So I mean, super interesting stuff. But this Pluto down at the bottom does rule the 8th house, and I do find that interesting because it does point to this sort of element of secrecy that that many people kind of allude to when it comes to central banks, that there's a lot of kind of deal making behind the scenes. You think about the Board of Governors, and this idea that there are, I mean, I find it interesting that there are 7 of them, because that's the same number as the 7 traditional planets. And also that when the Federal Reserve was set up, that that there were 12 kind of satellite banks, district kind of branches of federal banks across America. So again, very astrological, with the 12 signs, the 12 zodiac signs. Something that we also see echoed in the American Constitution, which I have written about on the Astro Insights blog. But this rulership of the 8th house, as I say, is interesting because it's other people's money, and it's about loans. And of course, one of the traditional roles of a central bank is to lend money to banks, to other banks. So you have this kind of element about plutocracy kind of creeping in, because of course the banking industry is seen as being very elite, and only for people that have gone to like Ivy League schools and their chums. And there's this whole kind of thing about handshakes that kind of go on behind the scenes, and sort of backroom policies and things. So I think having Pluto on the IC, which is the most private part of any chart, it's the darkest part, it's the kind of midnight position of the chart, as opposed to the sort of midday position where the sun is, that there is this kind of it's set up in the Federal Reserve chart for there to be this this flavor of kind of shady or just secretive dealings behind closed doors, if you like, and also this connection to power as well through the MCIC axis. That at root, it was a sort of a bunch of bankers that got together to sort of create the Aldrich Plan in 1910. And that is what ultimately led to the Federal Reserve Act. But so there has always been this connection to wealthy individuals and that kind of thing. But yes, and then on top of that, the other thing to sort of bear in mind is that the chart, because we've got Aries rising, it means that Mars is actually the chart ruler, and it's interesting that it's also in the 4th house, and that it sits with one of the stars in Gemini. Castor, one of the twins. And I mean, the story of Castor and Pollux is interesting because they weren't actually twins. They were brothers. They were born separately, but they were the 2 sons of Jupiter and of Zeus, and they would sort of go on to become kind of these sort of warrior twins, if you like. And Castor, certainly according to Bernadette Brady, was the sort of the lighter of the twin polarity, very much associated with strategy and with enlightenment and with thinking things through and with ideas and that kind of thing. So that association, I think, with Mars does fit with this idea of why the Federal Reserve was initially set up, which is to sort of to intervene in the economy strategically to make sure that it's stabilized, to prevent crises and sort of further banks failing or runs on the banks, and also to make sure that in times of crisis that emergency loans and things can be made to larger institutions so that they don't fail, because of course if they're holding depositors' money, that's not really ideal, and also to sort of to keep things like interest rates and so on in check. That's kind of the idea. But of course Mars is an interesting one because it is also the sign of the kind of the butcher or the soldier, and it's not particularly happy in the sign of Cancer, and that's because it is exalted in Capricorn. So Cancer is where it is considered to be in force. So in other words, it doesn't operate very well here. So although the Federal Reserve was set up essentially to sort of to make sure that unemployment stayed on an even keel and the economy stayed on an even keel, there is this slightly kind of hawkish aspect to it, with Mars sort of being where it is. And I do think it's interesting that not far away we've got Neptune, also in the sign of Cancer, but in the 5th house of speculation, and it's opposite the Jupiter in the chart, which is again a little bit detrimented in Capricorn, in the 11th house. So to me, this, I think, points to that kind of schism between what an organization is ostensibly there to do and sort of be for the kind of public good on the one hand, with that Jupiter in the 11th house, to be sensible, to sort of stabilize and to pump money into the economy when needed to stimulate economic growth and so on and so on. But then on the other hand, it's being pulled by this Neptune in the 5th house of speculation, and Neptune, generally speaking, it's very porous, it doesn't have good boundaries, it can kind of lean towards fantasy, and to have it in the 5th house of speculation, I think, points to the relationship between the Federal Reserve and Wall Street, where there's this kind of money printing that goes on, and with the money supply, kind of the M2 money supply, and how this goes straight to Wall Street and it inflates assets such as stocks, for example, and that's why you see huge bubbles and kind of speculative bubbles and things like that in the financial markets. So yes, it's kind of an interesting one. The other thing that's quite interesting about this chart is the moon is Scorpio in the 8th house, and it sits between those two fixed stars that we were talking about earlier, Alphecca and Acrux. So the two stars that are very important in American, particularly political life, to do with the president. And the moon in Scorpio again is interesting because the moon is in fall in Scorpio. So there's a lot of planets in this chart that are not in their best places, that are not working at their sort of optimum, if you like. It's debilitated in a lot of ways. So the moon in Scorpio, although it is very loyal and it isn't necessarily in and of itself negative, it can sometimes be associated with, as I said, it is somewhat debilitated. So I think it's interesting that it sits between Alphecca and Acrux, and that it's from there it's squared to the pot of fortune in the 11th house. So it again points with this 8th house to maybe a slightly troubled relationship between lending to the banks and to other institutions on one hand, so in other words kind of the B2B model, versus the sort of more public role, which is supposed to be stabilizing the economy, making sure that America stays wealthy, that that employment figures continue to rise, etc., which is what the pot of fortune is supposed to do. It's in the house of groups and that kind of thing. So this is kind of altruistic element, which is emphasized by the presence nearby of Uranus, which is at about 5 degrees of Aquarius. So both of these are sort of quite philanthropic, altruistic kind of, in altruistic signs, and placed in the 11th house, which is naturally associated with Aquarius anyway. It stands in stark contrast to, as I said, the slightly more secretive energy of the Scorpio moon in the 8th house, which, you know, is ruled by Pluto. So this is the slightly more, I suppose, the fact that the sort of the Bank of Governors are kind of independent shareholders, and that they very often are wealthy, and that even though the organization is supposed to be independent, you know, a lot of people say that it isn't, because very often governors of the Bank of England the Federal Reserve go on to be politicians in the Treasury, that kind of thing, the US Treasury. So there's this very close, chummy relationship between kind of Washington and the Federal Reserve. So, you know, is it partisan? You know, is it sort of entirely politically independent? I don't know. It's hard to say. But I think those are the key things to note about the chart itself. Let's have a look at some of the aspects kind of next. So here we've got a double chart, and inside we've got the Federal Reserve's natal chart, and then on the outside I have transposed the transits for the 25th of January. So, you know, around about the time of this meeting that's supposed to be happening. And there are a couple of things that are definitely worth kind of noting. The first being transiting Scorpio, which is opposing the moon in Scorpio in, you know, in that 8th house. So the moon that we've just been talking about, and you can see transiting Uranus here at that pivot point that we were talking about, where it's moving, it's sitting on the point where it went square to Saturn, and then it's moving forward, you know, into the Federal Reserve's 2nd house, which is the house of money. And, you know, and approaching the moon is the transiting moon, which is at 7 degrees of Scorpio. So it's only got 3 degrees to go to form a conjunction to the natal moon of the Federal Reserve. So it does look as though this particular opposition is going to be very, very significant. And on top of that, it forms part of a T-square to Saturn and to that part of fortune that we were talking about here in the 11th house. So a T-square, generally speaking, creates a lot of tension, and usually you look to the apex of the triangle to see what the sort of focus is. And here, you know, it is about kind of collective policy and this balancing act that the Federal Reserve is trying to sort of walk between trying to curb inflation and to sort of keep certain factors from tipping into dangerous territory. So trying to sort of like keep the market from becoming too much of a bubble on the one hand, and then on the other hand depressing it too much so that, you know, that sentiment kind of flows out of the market and people lose confidence, and there's less economic growth. So I think those are represented really by Saturn and the Sun here, those transiting planets that we've got here. So they are kind of walking a bit of a tightrope. And on top of that, we've got transiting Mars on the midheaven, which is quite hawkish, I have to say. You know, Mars, generally speaking, is on the warpath, and it's interesting that it's just newly ingressed into Capricorn, which is where it's exalted, actually. And of course, Mars is the ruler of the chart. So this could be very, very important. And it's opposing the Pluto down at the bottom, you know, here in the 4th house. So, you know, and Pluto rules the 8th house, so it rules this 8th house cusp, which is, as I say, where we have this idea of kind of agreements, or sort of things like taxes and debt and, you know, all that kind of thing. So, I mean, the fact that Mars is sort of on that, first of all, on the Federal Reserve Sun, and secondly, opposing Pluto, I mean, it could point to, you know, potentially like an interest rate hike, because, as I say, Mars is quite hawkish. And we do have this fixed T-square with Uranus, which can sometimes bring about unpleasant surprises. So, you know, we've got Uranus, as I say, squaring the Federal Reserve moon from the 2nd house, and then we've also got the Sun coming up to a conjunction with with the Federal Reserve Uranus, which is at 5 degrees of Aquarius, and you can see the sun is also at about 5 on that particular day. And if we think about what Uranus rules in the chart, it does rule the cusp of the 12th house, which is generally about kind of like secret plans or hidden enemies, or like unexpected developments, things that are sort of below the surface, which are not always necessarily in everyone's best interests. So it's certainly possible, but then on the other hand, we've got some quite positive aspects. So we've got that retrograde Venus forming a mini grand trine to, first of all, the Fed Chiron, and secondly the moon. So you can see retrograde Venus here at about 11 degrees or so of Capricorn in the 10th house, which is to do with leadership and to do with being in the spotlight. So it can be about like press announcements, that kind of thing. So I mean, it could be someone like Janet Yellen and her kind of her ongoing connection to the Federal Reserve, through her oldest, like, being the former governor there. I mean, she's now obviously with the Treasury. So it could be that for kind of policy reasons, for diplomatic reasons, that they choose not to do an interest rate hike, because they realize that on certain levels the world economy might be a little bit vulnerable, which is what Chiron can kind of point to here. So that's one thing. And then we also have, as I say, we've got that Mercury, that retrograde Mercury at 0 degrees of Aquarius, kind of approaching Pluto. So it's moving back towards Pluto here. And as it does so, it's going to go over the Federal Reserve Jupiter. So that could, even though it could in the short term lead to fears and worries about a bit of doom and gloom, it could also potentially have quite a buoyant effect as it comes up to 23. So you can see this it's from 26 to 23, it's 3 degrees. So it could be that kind of retrograde Mercury starts off looking quite negative, and then heads into sort of positive territory. Yeah, so I mean, jury is kind of out. I think that the key factor here in terms of announcements is Mercury, because it does rule the 3rd house of kind of announcements, and then that Venus, which sits in the, it's currently sitting in the 10th house. And as I say, Venus making some positive aspects to the moon and to Chiron and to the North Node, which does bode well, and which looks like good news. So positive policy coming out of the Treasury. And so if you think that Venus natally in the chart is in the 9th house of kind of foreign relations, to me it doesn't exactly point to like an interest rate hike in that sense, because we have already had some noises coming from some of the other central banks in Europe saying to Jerome Powell, listen, we could do without another like interest rate hike at this point, because your policy tends to affect the global economics, and Europe isn't ready for interest rate hikes. So, it's the same in the UK, where interest rates have really kind of stayed static, because the economy is really battling kind of post-Brexit, that there's been a lot of inflation as a result of Brexit, and things are still too uncertain to sort of raise interest rates. So, when it comes to sort of international policy, I think that could certainly be what sparks off that positive mini grand trine. Of course, the jury's out about Mercury, whether when it hits Pluto, that it sort of sets off other concerns to do with, as I say, like interbank lending, or links to tax, that kind of thing. And of course, the Federal Reserve, even though it doesn't influence, it's supposed to be independent and doesn't influence economic policy per se, we know that there's a long history of connection between the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury. So it is possible that what that kind of leads to is kind of more rumblings about legislation, about taxing of certain assets classes, that kind of thing, as a way to potentially raise revenue to pay for stimulus bills and that kind of thing. And then we've got the Sun and Saturn kind of going over the Uranus, which is a little bit of a wild card, I must be honest, especially since it is kind of at the apex of that T-square with transiting Uranus and the moon. So can't say 100%. Uranus is a little bit unpredictable. We are talking here about Taurus and Scorpio. So it's possible that some of the things that they said back in November when we had the lunar eclipse, which was in that axis, may be pertinent now. So it might be worth going back to check what was said back in November by the Fed, because it might be that some things from those minutes or that policy kind of hints and that kind of thing may be relevant now. Yeah, that's what I would kind of say. I mean, if we briefly go back to the calendar for January, you can see that the waning moon cycle, we're kind of in that last week of January of the waning moon cycle before we head into the 1st of February, which is Chinese kind of New Year on the 1st of February, and we have a new moon. So we enter a new lunar cycle. And you can see that essentially during this week, we have Mars moving into Capricorn, which is generally speaking very positive. It's where you can achieve goals and plans quite quickly with focus and drive. You're quite self-disciplined. You have strong ambitions and that kind of thing. So it's real kind of goat energy, which is very positive generally for, economically speaking. Then we've got this retrograde Mercury moving back into Capricorn. So again, moving back into sort of Capricorn type of energy, which is again quite cautious, prudent, but it's also very good for economics on the 26th. So, I don't necessarily see this as being looking kind of bearish. I think it's just looking cautious and prudent, which is what the human design, the I Ching, is telling us to do, is to be cautious and prudent and to kind of shed anything excessive, to tighten our belts a little bit and to live within our means. And then we don't really have any aspects until the 29th, which is when when Venus stations. So that's a positive thing, because Venus is going to be making a very positive aspect to Uranus on the same day. She's going to be making a trine to Uranus, kind of coming into order for trine. And at the same time, maybe slightly more negatively, this retrograde Mercury reaches Pluto. So that could be a little bit of doom and gloom kind of coming in there, or we might sort of start to get a little bit paranoid and worried about like plutocracies and market manipulation, that kind of thing. But I think it's the end of the waning moon cycle, so I think it's kind of, we're almost drawing a line under things when we come to the end of January, and the fact that Venus is stationing, and as I say, that it is moving into this trine to Uranus, which is so important in the Bitcoin chart, I think does bode quite well. So you can see as we move into February, we've got a new moon on the first day of the month. So for me, this is fresh energy, it's new energy. We've got Mercury stationing within a few days, and there are some very, very positive aspects coming up in February, including a Venus-Mars conjunction, and also a very, very auspicious conjunction between Jupiter and Uranus, I think. A sextile here on the 18th. It's kind of very close to full moon. So I'm not feeling particularly sort of bearish, I must be honest. And I think that, when we kind of weigh things up, when we weigh up the Gann cycle, which looks as though the earliest a recession would come would be the autumn of 2022, when we weigh up the fact that there are still these positive aspects in the Bitcoin chart yet to come, which usually, which signify blow off tops and euphoria, and those only happen from the end of January kind of onwards, I think those two factors alone, plus the Elliot wave theory, makes me cautiously optimistic. So even though we are having a kind of a pivot down and a bit of a downtrend, I don't think it's going to last. That is my sort of gut feeling. That's what I said in my last video. And if we weigh up all the factors kind of concerned, it would say, yes, certainly be cautious now, get rid of cut your losses now if you are bleeding money and you can't really afford to bleed money in terms of stocks and shares. But at the same time, I don't think it's all kind of down from here. So yeah, those are my kind of feelings at the moment. We'll see where we are when we come to that new moon on the 1st of February. But until then, take care, all the best, and be well.